Here we are once again. Barak Engel is going to be doing a reading of his so far fantastical book. We're on to chapter 7, Werewolf. The last chapter was Nael. It was very well done as far as the artistic and creative aspects of being able to shape sound once it leaves your instrument, which resonated with me because that's what fantasy is about, right? Every person, creative person or a musician wants to be able to do that, but can't. But in Barak world, we can. So with no further ado, on this dark and stormy night in Tiburon, California, Barak Engel.
Greg is a very talented musician, so
we can go that far.
That chapter, the reaction he had to that chapter meant a great deal to me as the author. So today is the 7th of the 9 tapestry laying chapters. So we had 6 so far, 3 interlacing ones and 3 main protagonists out of the 5. This one is called Werewolf, and it's the last interlacing chapter. So it's the last that doesn't introduce a person, an important, like one of our main people in the book. And I will repeat for Ariel, who unfortunately could not be here tonight. It is her analogy, and it deserves to be repeated every time. So this is the little dim light bulb in the darkened room, lighting up another corner for us. An event in time and place in this world that seems completely unrelated to everything else that we've talked about, but is in fact extremely important. One last comment I want to make before we jump into it. Just like with elves, which over the last couple of chapters, we, sort of changed the perception of what elves are in order to, for me, correct some fundamental fantasy errors in the way that we generally think about elves. This one is called Werewolf, and it's about a werewolf, but as you will discover within a couple of paragraphs, probably, my werewolves are not your traditional werewolves. They're kind of different. And my last little bit of trigger warning, just like all the last chapters, don't be here if you're not 18 and if you are offended easily, because this will offend you easily as well.
Thank you for that.
All right, well, let's get to it. So 5, Act 1, Chapter 7, 107, Werewolf. Her scent was new. Not from here, he thought. No, definitely not. Oh, wait a second, what is it? Oh. New as the scent was, it was also strangely familiar in the way that the scents of various kinds of plain two-legs were. There wasn't much difference between any of them, actually, except the ones that were more likely to present a bigger challenge to him, even while he was in his normal form. The orcs. The blood was a little spicier, but he didn't fancy it. To him, they were both more tricky to overcome and less tasty. He tended to leave them alone. Many of the others in the pack, his wolfkin, actually lusted after orc blood, which suited their palates better. This was fine with him because his brothers often let him chase down by himself the gentler fare that he preferred. Small ones especially were sweeter, more to his liking. Plus, they were also a heck of a lot less dangerous on the full moon 3 days when he transitioned from being a wolf and into one of them. He hated those days. All the werewolves did. When he picked up the scent, it was on the day right after re-wolfing. He was really hungry by then because he hid in a cave while he transformed and ate unsatisfying things like berries. He consumed just enough to not starve, but otherwise avoided everything and tried to sleep it off. One time, he had been surprised by a pack of well-armed two-legs who came into his secluded cave seeking shelter from the rain. That was one of the many silly things the two-legs did because they didn't have a nice thick coat to keep them dry. Or rather, they did have them, but the coat soaked up the water so badly that they literally came off the two-legs' backs. He never quite understood how they got the coats in the first place because he never managed to grow one during the moon days, but he concluded early on that it didn't really matter because the two-leg coats were so useless. He was sleeping deeply, and his weakened senses in his non-wolf form didn't warn him. So he woke with a start to find them surrounding him with their pointy sticks leveled at him. They were also making big sounds in his direction, which he thought was an attempt to communicate, but he had no idea what it was that they were trying to convey. So he just bared his pitiful two-legged teeth at them and growled. They also made a lot of noises amongst themselves, which sounded to him like they were arguing about him, probably, about what to do with him. It was the one time in his life that he felt truly scared. He was vulnerable like they were when he was in his were state. Eventually, they tied him up and left, and he guessed that they had expected to come back later after figuring out what to do with him, except that the 3-day was almost up, and so a little bit later he re-wolfed and transforming back into his normal form, in the process breaking the bonds that held him, and left. He was hungry, and the easiest thing to do would have been to hunt them down with their scent trails being so close, but he remembered all the pointy sticks and the shine that burned, and decided that it would be better to just chase down a nearby rabbit. A couple of days later, he got bored and sniffed them out and did follow them for a bit, but they stayed in a pack, which meant he never had an easy opportunity to go after just one of them. Eventually, he gave it up once they went down the trail to the path over the white waters. There was one thing, though, that stuck in his mind forever. That morning, they all huddled together by a fire in a clearing. He didn't like fires, but unlike many of his brethren, wasn't overly afraid of them either. One of them was lying on the ground, breathing heavily and grunting and yelping repeatedly. He couldn't quite get close enough to see inside the circle. The two legs had arranged themselves in such a way so that they would see him immediately if he tried to get close. And they had those shiny, pointy sticks out, alert to any movement at the edge of the clearing. But he knew from her scent that the one in the middle was a female. And when she screamed out loud and a new scent hit his nose, he understood that she had just given birth. That smell was so fresh, so sweet, and so incredibly deliciously pure that he was almost compelled to charge towards it, which would have likely gotten him killed. He had never smelled two-legged cub before, and yet since that moment, it became an obsession for him to try one. He kept seeking it for many years, but while he learned to identify when two-legged females were in heat and when they were pregnant, he never came across an opportunity like that again. They always traveled in packs, well armed and protected, and not even once since that time he had witnessed a birth again. The memory of that scent was driving him crazy with desire. And then he smelled her, and he knew that finally his time had come. She was pregnant. She was alone. All he had to do was bide his time until she gave birth, which he knew was going to be soon, very soon. And he had weeks before his next transition. He just had to be patient and track her, follow her, and wait. He would strike at exactly the right moment. He might even let her live. He just had to have the cub. The sun came and went several times, and her movement through the fields and forests was fairly slow. He was amazed at how unconcerned she seemed to be with her own safety. He wasn't the only wolf around, for one thing, and there were always many other dangers, but she never looked or smelled scared, instead carrying herself with a smell of confidence and an air of supreme calmness. If she were a wolf, he thought, she would have been ahead of the pack. She was clearly heavily pregnant, which slowed her down, and he wondered what she was doing there. Was she lost? But it didn't seem that way, as her movements were purposeful and directed. She was searching for something, or perhaps more than one thing, because on at least one occasion, she seemed very excited by some item she had picked off the ground after digging under some stones. Something that he couldn't see, yet for some reason, even at a significant distance, made him uncomfortable. She kept searching. It interested him, this two-leg that was so unafraid, and he found himself being protective of her. Once, he even dispatched a nasty orc who'd begun stalking her, intending to strike when she took a rest. No way are you stealing her cub from me, he remembered thinking before jumping on the orc, crunching its neck between his powerful jaws, before hurriedly letting the lifeless body go and spitting out the blood. He could never get used to that taste, but he knew his brothers would want the orc, so he dragged it away and howled at them to come and grab it. Later on, he finally understood and admired why she was so confident. He had been keeping a safe distance, so he had no way to stop them from coming at her, without revealing himself and ruining the plan. He would have had to run straight through her in order to get to them before they got to her. There were two of them, which he knew were an orc and a goblin. He watched with horror and anger as his prey being stolen, his dreams of finally indulging in two-legged cubs seemingly dashed by the random nature of the wilderness. But he needn't have worried. Even heavy as she was, she drew, quick as lightning, a beautiful shining blade, a shine that he knew would burn his skin, and then entered into a dance of sorts. Moving rapidly yet gracefully, she spun her sword in an intricate pattern that, after it was wet with her first strike, looked like she was drawing blood symbols in the air. He was entranced. He had never seen a two-leg moving so eloquently before, and every movement she made was perfectly timed, leading to maximum impact in the exact location as to disable and then destroy her two opponents. It only took her a few seconds to kill both of them. She didn't even break a sweat. What an exquisite creature, he thought, and then salivated. Her cub will taste amazing. So when she crossed the path over the white water, he waited until the darkness fell and the waters rose underneath. Then, avoiding all the two-legged guards, he summoned every ounce of courage he had and swam to the other side. Werewolves were naturally strong and excellent swimmers, but the white waters were dangerous. By the time he made it through, he was so heavily bruised and battered that he was barely alive. When the day finally came, he was ready. After she had killed those other two legs, one of them in its dying throes had managed to slash her calf, giving her a noticeable limp. The cut even had that unpleasant smell to it, the one that he knew would make his stomach upset if he ate the flesh around it. She was therefore walking slower than ever. Then suddenly he heard her let out a small yelp and grab her belly. After a moment to catch herself, she took several deep breaths, and he could see that her legs had gotten all wet, which was weird at first because he couldn't actually smell any pee. Soon he recognized the smell for what it really was. She looked up and started moving towards a forest clearing. He followed cautiously, getting aroused from the thought that he might finally get his chance. He had no idea what to expect, except that in that one other time, it took several hours for the cub to be born. Two legs were strange like that, since they were extremely vulnerable while giving birth, and it made no sense to him that they would allow themselves so much time to do the birthing. She made it to the center of the clearing and lay down. He sat on his haunches to wait. It took a good part of the day. Around the time that the sun came to be in the middle of the sky, he let out the first howl. He knew that she couldn't move away anymore, and it was time. She heard him and raised her head towards him. Even though she couldn't actually see him, he could see her, and he noticed that the look of pain etched all over her face was joined with a look of deep worry. He could even smell a hint of fear, which was very exciting, seeing how up to this point, she seemed to fear nothing. His sense of arousal deepened. He kept howling. Eventually, two of his cousins heard him and after a while joined him. They looked at him, demanding to know why they shouldn't simply go and tear such an easy prey apart, but he instructed them to wait. He wanted the cub. They could have her for themselves once he got that. It was a fair deal, and so they all waited together. As the sun dipped below the treetops, he could see a little head show up between her legs, and moments later, an entire two-legged cub came shooting out of her. The smell of it was utterly intoxicating. She knew that the wolves were there. One of them had been following her for days, even somehow making it across the heavily guarded storm bridge, but stayed away. She suspected that it was a werewolf, which would complicate things. While she had no idea why a werewolf would stalk her that way, she did know that they could think far more deeply than other wolves, almost in fact, as well as any of the other humanoid races could. They could even plan. She had wished that it would come after her, hoping to confront it before the baby came, but it kept its distance. When her water broke early, she could no longer worry about it. Nature had to take its course. She headed towards the clearing she had previously determined would be the best spot to deliver should it happen out of reach of the cave she had chosen for when the moment came. Perhaps the werewolf was not especially hungry and would continue just to watch her. Her biggest wish was that the delivery would be a quick one, like it was the last time. It wasn't to be. When the howling started, she was no longer able to move. Her sword was at her side, but she knew that there was no way she could fend off even a single werewolf if it decided to attack while she was in labor, let alone it and the two other huge wolves assembled at the edge of the clearing. She could see their silhouettes and hear their growls and murmurs as they conversed in wolf tongue. She found herself wondering what they were waiting for. There was nothing she could do about any of it, so she focused on breathing and trying to accelerate the process of delivering her child. It finally happened. The boy shot out of her suddenly like an arrow, landing on the bed of leaves she had made between her legs. Utterly exhausted from the effort, she picked up her sword and stood up shakily on her feet, grinding her teeth against the pain from the infected wound caused by the accursed goblin. And she admitted to herself for the 100th time her own carelessness when she dispatched it. She barely had time to cut off the umbilical cord and place the good luck talisman she had found just a couple of days before over her son's chest before the wolves appeared. She uttered a quick prayer, and the talisman flashed briefly. Her son was cooing. The wolves were grinning. She held up her sword, turning it the right way to make it glint, showing the werewolf that it was silvered. In her other hand, she held up the mechanical torch she had carried with her, lighting it with an expert flick of her fingers on the embedded firing mechanism. It burst into flame, and she held it forward too. But she had very little hope that any of it would work. Turning away a wolf by the implicit suggestion that easier prey might be had elsewhere was one thing. 3 were a whole other matter, especially when they included a werewolf. Having one of them present meant that they would act as a unit. Under the werewolf's command, they would cooperate. And these wolves had been talking to each other for a while. As he had planned, they moved forward together, spreading a bit so they could surround her in a half circle, the best way for this size of group to take down a single prey. The smell of the cub was so compelling that he found it extremely hard to stay in control, but he just managed it, baring his fangs as he moved toward the center of the clearing. Then she stood up, that shiny blade in one hand and a flaming torch in another. He didn't like either of those things. His cousins were getting a little anxious. He reminded them that there were 3 of them and only 1 two-leg. After a moment, they continued their careful advance. His mouth was already filled with saliva at the smell of the cub, mixed in with the blood from the birthing. Then she started dancing. He had seen her move before, but his kin had not, so they didn't expect it, although he had warned them to watch out. She flowed like a whirlwind, and even in her obviously weakened state, he could not help but admire the rapidity and precision of her complicated gestures. Glad again for her experience from the wars, ignoring the bolts of pain shooting from her shin, she mustered all her strength and executed a complex series of steps that in a flash took her near the wolf on the left. As he tried to unsuccessfully snap at her, fooled by the movement of her sword, she touched the torch to his back, and then just as rapidly positioned herself back above her newborn son. The werewolf wouldn't be seriously hurt by that, but the other 2 could, and she hoped that it would serve as a warning, or at least a distraction. The wolf yelped, then rolled on the ground to put out the fire before standing back up and growling in pain and anger. She guessed that they were reassessing the threat, inquiring with their leader, and at least for the moment, she had checked their advance. She quickly scanned right and left to ensure that the 2 big wolves flanking her were holding position, then locked her gaze on the one in the middle, the one that had been following her, the biggest of the 3, the leader, the werewolf. It looked hungrier and much more determined than the others. It was looking back at her, calculating, reflecting the intelligence that made it so much more dangerous than any other kind of wolf. It was eyeing her baby. The scent was so strong now that he could taste it. His kin were a little more nervous now. She had singed one of them pretty badly, and they all knew that the shiny blade would hurt them a lot, him most of all. He snarled at them to press the attack. They didn't budge. He took a step forward, causing her to swiftly point a torch at him. That was good because he wasn't afraid of fire as his packmates were. Keep your torch on me, 2-leg bitch. He took another step forward and took a deep breath, letting that gorgeous smell fill his nostrils. The other 2 were looking at him, then at her, uncertain about what to do next. But she didn't know that. He barked at them, commanding them. A second later, they both took a step forward in concert. His nose told him that she was growing more fearful, and he could see her legs shake. She was tired, her torch lowered and aimed right at his eyes. Yes, I'm your target. I am, not them. His 2 cousins had drawn courage from him and made a couple more steps towards her. Soon enough, they would be within jumping distance. She would be finished then. The wolves were closing in. She was exhausted and could barely keep standing. Another quick sideways glance, and she could tell that in 1 or 2 more steps, they would be close enough to jump her. There was no way to defeat them, not even if she were at her peak, let alone in her present state. Time was running out. She had to make a decision, and she had to make it now. There was no way to save both herself and her son. She would have to leave him behind. The inevitable victory and tasty meal were both at hand. He paused for a second and relished the moment. The time came. In the way that wolves knew they were certain to overcome their prey, they all moved in the same instant. Unexpectedly, she moved at that exact same instant. Suddenly, as they rushed her, she jumped out and sideways. Her sword flashed and one of his kin yelped, then barked and dropped to the ground, screaming. He had a massive gash across his side, but his wounds did not look fatal. He would likely hunt again. She was already running across the clearing, limping slightly on that nasty-smelling leg. His other kin was chasing her, but he suspected that he wouldn't catch her. This two-leg had remarkable agility and speed and could easily climb up a tall tree, and he suspected could even jump amongst the trees if she had to. He had seen her fight those goblins. He didn't care about any of that, or about the stranger he could smell who was watching them, because the cub was lying there, helpless, making small noises. It was lit in a strange way, too, making its soft features all the more compelling. He turned, his mind filled with delicious anticipation, and took a step towards it. He let his mouth fall open, saliva dripping out. For some reason he didn't understand, he found it really difficult to get nearer to the cub. He wondered if this was why the two-legged cubs somehow survived, but he was no regular wolf. Then, suddenly, the cub blew up at him. Having made her decision, she moved swiftly, slicing across the wolf on the right with her sword while giving herself enough leverage to leap over it and run towards the edge of the clearing. The wolf fell to the ground injured, while the one she had burned before ran after her. She flung her torch at it to slow it down. As she made her way out of the clearing to escape, the werewolf turned on the baby. Its mouth opened, and he took a step towards the defenseless creature. It had a hungry look in its eyes, but also more than that. It seemed desperate, as if it were a dying man seeking water in a desert. As it came nearer to the baby, the small chain talisman placed on the baby's chest suddenly radiated outwards, a bright aura of white and silver. It engulfed the huge werewolf. The great beast yelped as if it had been physically and violently struck by the talisman's aura. It closed its eyes and reopened them slowly. Desperation and determination were mixed in with hurt, suspicion, and anger. The injured wolf to its left reacted even more strongly to the light, struggling up to its feet and limping away from the clearing, whimpering, its tail between its legs, a trail of fresh blood marking its retreat. But the werewolf was made of sterner stuff. It collected its courage and moved with obvious effort further into the bright aura. It needed only 2 steps to reach the baby, but each of those steps took many seconds, and it was grunting with exertion. Clearly in significant pain, it was shaking its head, growling, snapping at what seemed like an invisible fire burning its thick coat. Still, it seemed determined to get the baby, obsessed with the task. Eventually, it made it. The werewolf stood over the baby and opened its mouth to deliver the killing blow. Then it froze. Its muscles strained under its skin as it put in an enormous effort to lower its head and grab the defenseless newborn. The massive jaw moved perhaps an inch lower, but no more, and the werewolf howled in frustration, unable to shake off the mysterious force that was keeping it from the tiny, helpless prey inches in front of its nose. Then, with extreme effort, it lifted its enormous paw, the claws gleaming in the strange light emanating from the infant's chest, and reached with it ever so slowly towards the baby's face. The werewolf's body was shaking, and it was clearly putting everything it had into the effort. The light of the aura got brighter still, so bright that one could barely see into it anymore. The tip of a claw touched the baby's temple. The aura emanating from the baby's chest became blinding, and then the light, inaudibly yet physically, screamed. He saw the entire thing. There was no way he could help the woman or the baby or fend off the wolves. They were massive creatures, and he knew that they would shred him limb from limb. He had seen them hunt before. It was not a sight he cared to see again. When she left the baby to die, he sympathized, even as he admired the serious wound she managed to inflict on one of the wolves. But just as he was turning away to leave the unfolding horror of the scene before him, the light show began, and then, out of the blinding sphere of light in the middle of the clearing, the biggest wolf fled, howling and yelping, as if he were running away from a flaming explosion. Then the light faded, the wolves were gone, all was quiet, and the infant was still, somehow, inexplicably, right there in the center of the clearing. The baby started to whimper, and he knew that it would soon begin to cry. He jumped out from his cover and ran over to it. The boy, not even an hour old, was lying there with its tiny face bleeding profusely. It had delicate features and big blue eyes that looked up to him questioningly, and he noticed with some urgency, hungrily. The poor thing had only just been born. It would need to feed very soon. He bent down hurriedly to lift the baby, and as he did so, he completely failed to notice a dull chain with a small trinket at the end of it, sliding off the baby's naked chest and falling into the low grass below. Then he wrapped the little boy inside his warm coat and ran. And that is the end of the werewolf chapter.
That was captivating.
Yeah.
The description of the battle, or the way, and I kept coming back to like envisioning capoeira, what the woman does.
There's elements of that in that for sure.
Yeah,
intentionally.
But you kept saying dance, and like dancing and offensive, not just defensive.
Of course.
That was well done. That was well done.
Oh, thank you.
Also, one of the things I kept having to remind myself to remind you of, is it okay if I do this?
No.
I know. The randomness of nature, when you were talking about, well, somebody's going to die now. And it was just, that's the way it is. That's the way it is in nature. There's no, well, wait, let me plead my case. No. This is necessity, and I need to eat you, or whatever it is. That was cool.
Yeah, I was kind of curious to see your reaction if when I got to the point where the baby died before kind of undied, right?
Well, I was preparing myself for that.
Because you already know that I have no problem.
As soon as you
them.
said she was given up and she was going to save herself instead of the baby, I was like, A, surprised. And then B is like, okay, he's going to kill another kid. And but then as it went on, you could say, oh, there's hope. There's hope.
So one of the things I wondered if you guys were, if this was interesting for you, is this entire chapter is written like in these different perspectives, right? A lot of it is written from the actual wolf's perspective, right? And then you have.
I really appreciated that it was coming from the wolf's perspective, and the specific words that he was using to describe what was happening, right? It was I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I think it was more powerful coming from the wolf's perspective, as opposed to if it had just been the woman's perspective talking about the wolves, because you wouldn't have gotten that same feel of the wolf is driven by this obsession with having a two-legged cub, where the wolf has planned this for a very long time.
And of course, being a werewolf, it can obsess over something for a long period of time. But my werewolf is a wolf most of the month, and then changes into a human, for 3 days every month, as opposed to being a human that changes into right. So the entire script is flipped in many ways. Right?
Well, one of the things that's been stringed throughout all these chapters that you're doing quite well is these characters. Some of them are not human, but you're helping us relate to them, the human parts, but then you surprise us with these inhuman parts. Yeah. And this one did it more than any other, because the werewolf. So what you came through with was describing what it's like to prey, to stalk, and also the werewolf is, I don't know if smarter is the right word, but better at this stuff than the real wolves. And he brought them along and said, here, you do this. And the whole time, I want the cub. I want the baby. But he didn't say it, but it was, you could, and you made me relate to that. And say, yeah, that's what I would do.
Right? I mean, he's obsessed with this. He knows what he wants. He spent an enormous amount of time, and I can tell you years and years of its life.
Oh, another thing you captured was that inhuman quality of I smell a newborn, and that now I'm insatiable. And now that is, until I have that, I won't be satisfied. No. And that's not how humans think.
Right?
Cold and calculating, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's the predator.
But it's a
It's-
smart predator, right?
It's the mind
like,
of a predator.
right? When you think about humans being, you're absolutely right. I was hoping somebody would say
Yeah.
this. Humans are the ultimate predator, right? We can plan a war for 20 years and then execute. We can have revenge 300 years later through our generations past us. So now we have other creatures that can think for that long and perhaps even live longer than humans and can
Yeah.
plan for longer than humans do.
So there's a
And,
threat to the apex.
right, so there's a lot of so it's part of the strangeness of this world, right? So we keep going back to this whole thing. I'm using the word werewolf, which we all know and appreciate from how fantasy typically deals with it. And then it's like, oh, wait a second.
You know, the blending of moving from fantasy into the reality part where the feelings come into the picture, from the maternal instinct, I think is very well blended, being very honest. You have to constantly switch between, okay, I am in fantasy, he's talking fantasy, but he's relating in fantasy the, human-like features about maternal instincts, what maternal instincts can do. It's one of the most powerful things we humans do, it has been proven for centuries. I don't think I need to repeat that. If a mom wants to do something for the child, there is no force that can stop her. And I think that blending is amazing. And it's hard to, if you are not into it and you're not paying attention, you get lost into it. That, oh, he's talking about a werewolf. No, this is a person, a maternal werewolf thinking about. About her cub, thinking what to do about it and how to protect them. I think that relation is really captivating.
So you bring up an interesting for me, right? Because this mattered to me. Right? I'm writing about about these events, but I'm observing them. I'm describing things that are. I'm watching them and writing them. I'm not inventing them. If that makes any sense. In my mind, they're unfolding.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm not a writer. But I understand that, like, you see it. And you're describing on this.
Right. So as I'm doing that, this lady, for me, I felt the pain that she just gave birth to her baby. Right. And she has to leave it behind. She tries her best, right? I mean, she's having gangrene in her leg, right?
Times.
I mean, it's the amount of pain and suffering she goes through. And the discipline she has, I mentioned it very briefly. Her experience from the wars. I don't know if you caught that part, but right. So she's apparently somebody who was in wars and is a very experienced soldier of some sort, right? So that's what's kind of giving her the self-discipline to deal with this impossible situation. And even so, and thank you, Akhilesh, for bringing it up. Even so, she then has to make a decision, a very disciplined decision about what to do next. And what she realizes in that moment is that she can't even choose her son over herself. It's either he's dead or they're both dead. There's no real way for her to save him. And that's sort of the choice she's making in the moment.
That's a Sophie's choice almost.
She has to choose to survive.
But I want to take this back to the whole tapestry thing. So this lady, as you might imagine, and perhaps this baby and the stranger that picked him up, all of these will come back in the future, right? So
of course.
I go back to the way that I'm building this tapestry for you.
Yeah.
Of course, it seems completely unrelated to everything else. Why are you telling us about this werewolf? When did this happen?
So
what is going
unrelated.
on, right? But at the end of the day, all of these people that we've just discussed, perhaps even the werewolf itself, may come to visit us in the future. And the hope is that and this goes back to how this is all constructed. The hope is that the event is powerful enough to drop these hooks in your mind, right? You'll remember this moment because of the emotions in it, or because of
the decisions and the choices that have been
and
made.
how that impacted and how that translates a few years later, hundreds of years later. I'm not really telling you, but this happened at some point. All I can tell you is it happened in the past at some point. And the story that we will get to in Act 2 after the next 2 chapters actually has a lot of things that are impacted by all of these events, but sometime later in the future, which is going to be our present.
It's interesting because the way that you set this up, this is, in my head, I keep thinking, okay, this is the way legends begin. Where if it's hundreds of years in the future where it ties back in.
Perhaps. We shall see.
We shall see.
Wow. Chapter 7 was a doozy. The, having the kind of description of the hand-to-hand combat, and she's really good at it. And then the birth of a child and the vision of predation from the werewolf point of view. Barak pulled it off. That was chapter 7, Werewolf. Next chapter is Aiden, which is chapter 8 of Act 1, and we will be looking forward to that.
Mhm.